Good afternoon, everyone. So today we have the closest that we can have for movie star. So we have John Grings from the Smart Energy Council. It's great to have him here, especially that it's such a busy time for them. But we thought because it's busy time, it will be great also to have him here. So as you know, he's the CEO of the Smart Energy Council. He quite often in the news in different medias, and he pushes solar and solar storage quite high. So it's great to have you here. Thank you very much for coming, and please welcome John.
Well, thanks, Viz, and thanks very much for the opportunity to meet with you today in the Australian Cathedral to Solar Innovation. And you at the front line of doing that really important work that has spawned a global industry and that will actually take over the world. So it's a great delight to be here today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, and I might do that in a slightly different way than you might have heard before. When my mother was a girl of about 5 years of age, she lived in country Victoria, and she asked her father, my grandfather, whether she could ride her bike to the nearby Downer fields to meet up with her friends. And my grandfather turned to her and said, "Murdering fields." And she said, "Well, what are you talking about, Dad?" "Yeah, that's murdering fields. That's where the local Aboriginal population was exterminated through poisoning of the waterhole." So I personally think there's some unfinished business when it comes to Aboriginal Australia. I think there's a lot of stories that are yet to be told, and that's the way I'd like to acknowledge the first people of this great nation. I'm going to step through the presentation reasonably quickly. I hope we have a little bit of time for discussion at the end. Just to introduce the Smart Energy Council, we're a peak industry body, a not-for-profit organisation. We trace our history back to 1954 in Australia, and luminaries such as Professor Sproul have been some of the bedrock stalwarts of our organisation over many, many years. We have today about 1,000 corporate members and a database of about 26,000 that we correspond with regularly. To give you a sense, these are our platinum members, so you'll see big names, right across solar manufacturing, energy storage manufacturing, big distributors, large developers like the Lion Group and CWP Renewables. CWP are doing that 11 gigawatt project in the Kimberley of Western Australia, for example. People who are involved in certificate trading and others. Some of our gold members there, people like Caterpillar Energy Systems doing remote mining, that sort of thing. LGAS, an interesting company that want to disrupt themselves rather than being disrupted by the market. Some of our silver members, the largest manufacturer currently, Jinko Solar, LG Chem as well, UL that does all the testing for the industry, Ream Hot Water, recruiting companies and the like. And some of our bronze members there. We're a very diverse organisation calling on all parts of the ecosystem. It actually makes for a fantastic network. So if you need information and we can't help you, we can put you in touch with people who absolutely can. Friends, on the 1st of December, the first day of summer in Australia, we read in the media, that the rainforests of far north Queensland were on fire. That's a problem because to be defined as a rainforest, one of the characteristics is that it does not burn. So that environment had been distorted to such an extent that they could no longer be defined as rainforests, and they were on fire. Through the summer, of course, we saw blazes rage. We saw homes lost in Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania. 200,000 hectares, the heart of the Tasmanian forests, which haven't evolved for regenerative burning like other parts of Australia, smouldered right throughout went on for days and weeks and then months actually, as the heart of Tasmanian wilderness burned. 209 heat records were smashed across the country. 49.5 degrees in Port Augusta, 32 days at 45 degrees or higher. 45 degrees, 32 days in Marble Bar, and in Bourke 21 consecutive days above 40 degrees. And it wasn't just the bushfires, it was also the floods. Right? As the atmosphere warms, it holds more moisture, which then creates much more intense flooding activities, right? And we saw that thousands of people made homeless through Townsville in just an absolutely catastrophic event. And we don't have to cast our mind back. It's not just Australia where this is happening. In the summer, last summer, July last year, the northern part of Sweden, which sits inside the Arctic Circle, was on fire. And Sweden put an SOS out to the world because they have no experience with dealing with bushfires in the Arctic zone, 32.2 degrees Celsius, right? So, friends, I would contend that we've got a problem. In fact, I would contend that we have a climate emergency. And this has all happened in a world that has so far warmed by an average of 1 degree. Where are we headed currently? Well, this is a compilation of all of the projections made by the leading organisations done by the Guardian newspaper, an average of projections. And the average comes out to say that by the end of this century, we will have warmed by more than 3 degrees. That's what we're on track, that's what the average says, right? They could be wrong. So far, we are finding that the data scientists are tending to be a bit wrong. They're too conservative. It's worse than they're prepared to stand up and say, because we live in a toxic environment where scientists are cut down because it's become so toxic and ideological that you can't tell the truth about science. This is where we're heading. And so if that's what a 1 degree Australia looks like, what does a 3.1 degree Australia look like? I can tell you it's not very nice. So we are in the middle of a critical decade. We have this decade to turn the ship around. And I don't mean sitting back and putting your feet up on the table and saying, okay, we've got 12 years to act, so we start acting in 12 years. The job's got to be done in 12 years' time. Right? This is a massive challenge. What's the world doing? Well, the Powering Past Coal Alliance has now signed up, so this is no coal by 2030 in the OECD and no coal by 2050 in the rest of the world. They've signed up 80 countries to pledge to that, including countries like the UK, which will have banned coal, phased out coal completely by 2025. Imagine that bipartisan approach to actually do something on this issue. Canada, France, Mexico, New Zealand. So these are sensible countries actually taking sensible action. What's Australia's response? Well, at the climate change talks in Paris, we were the only country. Australia stood proudly alongside the United States at the sole pro-coal event at the climate talks. That, friends, is a national shame. That was the response of our government. I can tell you internationally, Australia is a global pariah when it comes to climate and renewable energy. So how did this come to be? Why are we in this position? Part one, coal. Australia is the Saudi Arabia of coal. We've got so much coal here, right? And so those who have a vested interest in developing that resource and selling it to the world and using it here in Australia want to do that for as long as humanly possible. They want to keep the coal generation open for as long as possible, and they want to build new coal assets right here in Australia. And they want to do that because of greed. Personal and corporate greed above the community and communal interest of our well-being on this planet. So Australia has become, welcome, come on in. Australia has become the equivalent of the tobacco industry in the 1970s. All of the data was in, right? We knew that tobacco killed you, right? But by playing hard politics, they kept the industry open for decades to come. That's the game that's at foot right now in Australia around coal. Keep it open for as long as possible, because every year means billions and billions of dollars more in the pockets of the vested interests that profit from the coal industry. That's the truth of the matter. They also, by extension, then want to scrap renewable energy targets and support. They want to undermine confidence in renewable energy. Big storm in South Australia, the towers get blown over, and it was renewables' fault. Completely unreliable, right? In fact, the talking points were drafted before the event occurred, right? It's appalling. They want to increase the cost of renewable energy projects, and they want to continue and increase the subsidies for coal. So we saw in the Parliament towards the end, actually, while the government actually lost control, the federal government lost control of the Parliament, you might recall, but at around that time, Senator Hanson and One Nation put up a proposal to build new coal-fired power stations. The government enthusiastically agreed. A delegation of 6 MPs, 5 from the Coalition and 1 from the ALP, went to Japan to see one of these so-called clean coal-fired power stations. Now, I'm not an expert in the efficiency of these things, but I'm told they're about 10% cleaner than an ordinary coal-fired power station, right? So they're still sort of 85% completely polluting when you've got a clean alternative. And of course, they came back and sprouted the need for Australia to go in this direction. So the front line of this debate today is the Galilee Basin. The Galilee Basin sits in Queensland. You can see it, it's the area in white. It is 247,000 square kilometres. It's the largest unmined coal reserve anywhere in the world. Now, if this were to be exploited, opened up with the 7 mines that are currently proposed, this mine on its own would become the equivalent of the 7th largest emitter in the world every year, right? There's hundreds and hundreds of years worth of coal actually stored here. And actually, it would, on that basis, this mine would actually be responsible for more emissions than the economy of the UK or of Canada.
Are you talking about all the mines there, or just one?
I'm talking about all the mines. I think there are 7 currently proposed. So if it were developed, if it were exploited. What we know is that resource, that Galilee Basin, must remain in the ground. It is an unburnable resource because it is not possible to exploit that and meet. We're not even going to meet, right? It's just going to blow us so far out of the water, we're not even going to be close. So we've got to phase out existing coal, and we've got to make sure there are no new coal-fired power stations built, here or around the world. And that's why there is such a focus on and a movement to really focus on that Galilee, because it's emblematic of the struggle between the vested interests and the community power, and that's why you're seeing such a focus on that as an emblematic issue. Part 2, the result. The Conservative side of politics has been completely torn asunder on the issue of climate and renewable energy policy. You saw that shadow play out between Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott, where then Peter Dutton was put up as a stalking horse and ended Malcolm Turnbull's prime ministership. Our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, who the social media referred to as the coal fondler-in-chief, brought into the federal parliament a lump of coal. Now, many people say that this image will haunt him, right? That this is really, it's such a terrible thing for him. In my view, this was his job application to become Prime Minister in the first place. He needed to virtue signal to those that held the factional power inside his side of politics that he was a man that was going to come down on the side of coal, the Galilee Basin, keep the industry open for as long as possible, make sure that people who profit today can continue to profit into the future. Barnaby Joyce, you would have seen just before the election campaign, calling on Australia to build, so the government to subsidise and fund the building of new coal-fired power stations in Australia. Think about that for a second. Taxpayers' money used to build new coal-fired power stations. We have a new Energy Minister, Angus Taylor. Angus Taylor was appointed just after the coup. Angus Taylor has an interesting history. For 10 years, he was, with Alan Jones, on the front line of the campaign against wind farms. He was the anti-wind farm flag bearer for that industry. He's now the Energy Minister for our nation. Okay. That's why you see political cartoons like this, where Scott Morrison, we're committed to bringing prices down, and Angus Taylor is saying, among other things, as he chops down all of the wind turbines across the country. Oh, and the trees. We have a new Environment Minister, a barrister who began her career actually advising the coal industry. That's her background, and who is so toxic they don't bring her out during an election campaign because she's such a liability on this issue and others. And so we also learnt that the Environment Minister, Melissa Price, signed off on the Adani project, so groundwater approval given, just days before we went to a federal election. Right? There was some unfinished business. There were some powerful people who wanted to make sure that nothing was held up. It was progressed as far as humanly possible. And so she absolutely did the bidding of those people and made sure that and that was against the advice of the department, by the way. It's appalling. So the Liberal and National parties in government, what's their record? What have we seen in the last 5-6 years in Canberra dealing with the Liberal National Party? Well, they have multiple times tried to abolish the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the $10 billion green bank that directly assists industry and projects. Oh, and provides a profit to the bottom line of the federal budget, by the way, a profit-making body. Abolish ARENA. Now, I know that researchers across the country are dependent on ARENA for absolutely critical research today, right? Well, they don't want to scale it back, they want to reprioritise, they want to abolish it altogether. To abolish the renewable energy target, and separately to abolish the small-scale renewable energy target scheme, so rooftop solar subsidies and support. They've proposed a NEG, a National Energy Guarantee, with a tiny emissions target, one that we would reach with business as usual, making no changes whatsoever, subsidising new coal-fired power stations and selling as much coal as we possibly can to the world. The large-scale renewable energy target, so the target for large-scale renewables is going to come in at around 23.5% by 2020. 23.5%. That's next year, 2020. Do you know what happens after next year for support for large-scale renewables, both solar, wind, hydro, any of those products? Absolutely nothing. There is no support. That closes. So what they've done here is just run down the clock to the point where, it expires. Oh, and by the way, we just haven't put anything else in its place. So they don't get the backlash of actually cutting something, axing something. They just sit on their hands and just don't act, so it closes anyway. It's the same result. But just a little less politically painful for them. Part 3, election time. One of the things that frustrates me, if I looked at these facts before the run-up to the election, I would have said Labor's going to romp it in, right? There's going to be a change of government and there's going to be a change of policy and approach. The closer we get to an election, the more concerned I become. And that's because Australians have a football mentality to politics. Remember at primary school, you were in the green team or the yellow team or the red team, right? You got assigned in year kinder probably, go Anna, you cheered for your schoolmates. Well, that's what happens in Australia, right? People grow up with a mentality of, I've got a flag and the colour is blue or the colour is yellow, right? And so they're not sufficiently engaged in this issue. It's not sufficiently high a priority for people. And that's the challenge that all of us have to actually turn around. We know that about 76% had decided how they were going to vote before the election. At the moment, we're at about 51-49 to Labor. But even the prospect of this government, with its record on climate and renewables, even the prospect that they could conceivably be re-elected is inconceivable, right? Should not even be a consideration, right? Because it's so appalling what's happened. And we've got less than 2 weeks to go, a week and a half to go. Where does the Labor Party stand? And one of the reasons I'm focused on Labor, because Labor today is the only alternative to form government, to actually take the benches of the Treasury, right? So Labor's policy, at least 50% renewables by 2030. And I must say that actually the Smart Energy Council had a very big hand in Labor adopting that. We probably met with Bill Shorten 4 or 5 times a year for the last 5 years. And when it was a big step that they took, and we're very pleased that they did. It's not enough though, but it's a start. 45% emission reduction target by 2030, 1 million home batteries by 2025, $10 billion for the CEFC, support for electric vehicles, support for renewables training. Now, I'm not here to be a flag bearer for the Labor Party, as I said, right? On Q&A on Monday night, Bill Shorten sat in front of the audience. He was asked the question, will a Labor government support Adani? Or will they stop Adani going ahead? And the answer was no. It was a very clear answer. A Labor government would not stop Adani going ahead, right? So I think we all have a piece of work to do. This is unfinished business. My own view is, let's not make perfect, or good the enemy of perfect, right? Let's lock in what we can, and then let's push harder, and then let's go to the next step. I'm particularly heartened by the advent of conservative independence. Karen Phelps, Zali Steagall, Oliver Yates, and others all around the country who are conservative. They come from the conservative side of politics, but they say this is madness. Why would we lock ourselves into what is clearly the wrong side of history? Why wouldn't we act on climate change? It's a great business opportunity. Investment, jobs, lower power prices for our economy. And so this is where I think this is really critical. We have to smash the conservative side. I don't care if you're a Liberal supporter, a National supporter, right? Ultimately, we need both sides of politics to agree on this stuff. That's where we need to be. And if we need to smash them in the process to get them there, well, so be it, is my view. So first, smash the incumbents hard. Make it really hurt. What I'd love to see is a party room on the Conservative side of politics after this election that's got 5 people in it. And they look at each other and they said, well, bloody hell, what went wrong? Well, I'll tell you what went wrong, right? And then someone will say, well, couldn't we recast this as being a positive thing? Well, yes, and why don't you do that? That's what will shift them, right? Second, we're going to weed out the worst offenders, which means sniping out people like Tony Abbott and others, the worst offenders, Peter Dutton and others, right? And that process is underway. The electorate is in the process of vomiting up those hardline conservatives, and I think that's absolutely fantastic, and all power to them. Contrast us with the UK. Last week, the UK became the first country to declare a climate emergency. Guess what? Bipartisan support, both sides of politics. To phase out coal, make it illegal by 2025, both sides of politics. That's the model that we need to emulate. We need all sides of politics to agree on this stuff. We're going to stop fighting this and get on with acting. Meanwhile, as you all know, solar PV becomes the cheapest form of generating electricity in the world. I took this photograph. It's interesting. This is at Alpha ESS, alumni of this university, Dong Lin, actually. His company up in China. So I went there in 2016. The system on the left-hand side was a 2.5 kilowatt hour lithium-ion battery pack. I went back the next year, 2017, and the system on the right-hand side was a 5.7 kilowatt hour lithium-ion battery pack. And I'm going back in a couple of weeks' time, and I'll be able to put the 10.4 kilowatt hour battery pack next to it, and it's smaller than both of those as well. That's just an illustration of what's happening in terms of lithium-ion battery development, and we're seeing the economies of scale and the prices reduce as we have with solar. And of course, electric vehicles. Every major vehicle manufacturer in the world is tooling up lines to produce electric vehicles. When a car manufacturer turns on a line, they never turn it off. They've got to push as many vehicles through as possible to get a return on the investment of the line, right? They're all about to start turning on the lines. The whole world is about to change. And guess what? Australia doesn't have an electric vehicle policy at all. Our current take-up rate last year, 0.002% of new vehicles in Australia were electric vehicles. And I've got to say, let me just not get too worked up about this, but successive Australian governments should be horsewhipped. Because for decades, people like the leaders of this school, of ANU, of CSIRO, have been saying to our political leaders, please look down here. Here is some really neat engineering that is going to change the world. It's going to turn into multi-billion-dollar industries for the world. You should, governments, pay some strategic attention to this capability, to nurture it and make sure we retain as much of that value for Australia as possible. And successive governments have said, nah, couldn't be bothered, right? And now we've got the ability to become the renewable hydrogen exporters to the world. What's a future government going to do about that? let's hope something rather than nothing, because we've had too much of that. At the Smart Energy Council, our focus, our next piece of work, I think hopefully with a federal Labor government, is to develop an accelerated transition plan. We actually need to transition to zero carbon emissions by 2030. That's what we need to do, and I think it's time to start telling people the truth and actually outlining a credible, affordable plan that transitions communities and actually brings people with us to actually achieve that outcome. Finally, my question to you is, will you act? And I would also say to you, if it isn't us in this room that takes action, who the bloody hell is going to? The final thing I want to do is to show you a little social media ad that we developed last weekend. And you can have a look at it if you like it. Please, we can organise for you to share it to your groups. Here we go, let's see. Big solar and wind projects are under construction, delivering the jobs, investment and cheaper power for the Australian economy. But all of this is at risk. A re-elected Morrison government wants to lock renewables out and lock coal in. Next year, the renewables plan ends. No more support for big solar, no action on climate change, clean energy jobs and investment lost. Don't vote for anyone who wants to wreck renewables. Vote for the clean, affordable, renewable energy Australia deserves. Vote for people who want to build renewables, not kill them. Thanks very much.
Questions? Johan, you was the first one to lift your hand.
So my question to you is, so we agree, fighting this climate change, trying to adapt the world is not just, putting more solar panels, it's changing the economy of how Australia works, changing the way the community comes together and act, right? So has Smart Energy Council ever thought about taking the step of actually becoming a political party?
At this stage, we haven't. So we're a not-for-profit, non-government organisation. In a sense, the last thing you want to do as a peak industry is be at war with a federal government, right? But we've had to take that step because we've had no other choice. It's either that or our industry is decimated. What has been surprising, though, is that with every step we take, we don't encounter any resistance. People know that this is the truth and they are flocking behind it. For me personally, the test will be, how does a Labor government act in the first term? If they deliver, if we can steer them, if we can work with them, that's fantastic. If they don't, if they squib it, then I think the time for action will absolutely be upon us.
80% of our coal gets exported. How does that fit in your, renewable target and stuff? How can we stop that besides our, cleaning up our own act?
So I think there are two parts. It's a very good question. The first thing we need to do is stop using coal domestically. What that does is it then gives us some moral authority when we're actually engaging with the world. At the moment, we have no moral authority on that. Second, I think coal exports have to be phased out and stopped. But I think that needs to be coordinated with a transition plan. So locally, we need to transition workers and communities. Globally, we need to work with those companies that are not part of the OECD, that have committed to actually closing coal by 2050 and making sure they're getting active steps. In my view, it's got to be done before 2050, but that's and we need to shift the world on.
But how, looking at Labour even, how can we work on that basis? To me, it's so far out, it seems almost ludicrous to expect that. How can we push them, And we've got a climate emergency, the house is on fire.
I agree, I do agree. And we do need to think about that in our planning. It's not just domestically, but internationally as well. Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, on one of your last slides, you talked about a just transition. Can you elaborate on what that might look like in the vision?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, the Queensland government has just set up what's called the Just Transition Authority. And the authority's work is actually to identify those communities. So let's say, the Hunter Valley in New South Wales, the area around Liddell Power Station, for example, other parts of Australia, coal mining areas of Australia. There needs to be a strategic thinking so that we've got a decade to make the transition. what are the jobs and industries that we need to put into those areas that are going to replace the jobs that are going to be lost? How do we reskill people and deploy them into other areas? Now, I don't contend that you're going to take 2,000 coal workers or coal-fired power station workers from Liddell and suddenly transition all those people into renewables. It's not going to happen like that, right? But there will be those extra jobs created. And we need to actually then, if you like, give that community resilience in the transition period and actually make sure that we don't leave people behind, because that's what people are scared of. That's the thing that's actually holding people back. So,
just a follow on from that, John. Thanks very much for your presentation. Just the jobs in renewables versus the jobs in coal is an interesting one, and maybe we should put some more numbers behind that. Particularly for photovoltaics on the rooftop, it's displacing retail electricity. The coal miners are earning 1 cent or 2 cents for every 30 cents that's sold at retail levels. And so that's the size of the pie they've got. For renewables, for photovoltaics on a rooftop, something between 11 and 30 cents is what you're displacing depending on self-consumption. So it's a ratio of 5 to 15 more jobs potentially in the renewables on particularly rooftop solar than compared to coal. Coal economically is one of the best ways that you can sort of not generate large returns on your money.
yeah. APVI has done a fantastic job mapping actually where solar is being deployed in Australia. If you look at the data, the further you are away from a GPO in any capital city in this country, the more likely you are to have solar on your rooftop. It's the mortgage belts of our big cities, right, and rural Australia where the take-up is the strongest. These are jobs being created in the places where we absolutely need jobs to be created. So it's a really good news story. Billions of dollars worth of investment, gigawatts under construction right now in big solar farms, a new development in Australia, and they're all creating jobs, employment, and the flow-on for security people and earth contractors and fencing people and hotel operators and someone who starts a business selling lunch to the 300 work people that are on the site every day. So
But it's not only that, it's tourism, it's more agriculture.
Absolutely.
Lock the Gate, by the way, has done a great survey on the Hunter Valley for a just transition. So anybody who's interested in that, they should have a look at their report. Just go to their website.
So you say that the council doesn't like to really find itself in the position of being at war with the coalition. I hope you're also at war with the Murdoch press, because it's not just vested interests in coal, it's some sort of inexplicable ideology that they just absolutely, before every election, regardless of fact, just come out against anything that they deem to be left, just for the sake of it. How do you deal with that?
once upon a time, Clive Palmer in the Palmer United Party was actually pro-renewables. He wasn't anti-coal, but he was definitely pro-renewables. And the way the mathematics worked in the Senate, actually we needed to be able to we needed to actually bring a coalition of people against those those pieces of legislation to abolish the CFC, to abolish AREMA. They came as pieces of legislation in front of the Senate. And we worked with every group that we could. I didn't care where I got the votes from. I just worked really hard to get the votes. I walked with Senator D.O. Wang from the Palmer United Party from his office to the chamber where he was about to vote to make sure he didn't change his mind at the last second, right, to actually save AREMA, for example, right? And afterwards I stood up and I did a press conference with Clive Palmer, right? I'm happy to support. Now today he's all about coal. He's about exploiting the Galilee Basin. We couldn't support the Palmer United Party in any form, or the United Australia Party now, right? In any form, right? But at that time, he was an actor that is traditionally on the far right, really, of politics. I don't care. If that gets us the numbers and gets us over the line, then they're the coalitions we'll build. So we'll work with it. And that's the message for the Conservative independents. You know, if we're not anti-conservatives, right? In fact, we think this is the best business story that Australia, the world's ever seen. We want to use the market to actually change the economy. So that's the first thing. The second thing about the press, I'm 7 minutes from Parliament House and I'm in the Federal Press Gallery. If there's a story on, I'm in the press gallery. And it's interesting, over time, even those that are initially sceptical or hostile, over time they're like, you just can't deny this. This is just too compelling. you know. And so we have great relationships with journalists right across the Fin Review, across Sky News, across ABC, across, you know, and even SBS, you know, the TV networks. So I think as long as you're there telling the story, I think you can break through on it.
But they want to get Labor in. I mean, Labor. They don't want Labor to come in.
Well, certainly the Murdoch Price do not, absolutely, you know. So, yeah. I think there's some more questions of his at the day.
John, welcome back. I was wondering if we're being too cautious in talking about the opportunities that renewable energy can offer to this country. I guess I see, and I think CWP Renewables see it a little bit, or not a little bit, a big bit. The British guy who bought the Whyalla Steelworks sees at least part of it, I think, too. But it's not a very prominent idea that rather than continue this exporting our energy resources and exporting our minerals, so clever people somewhere else can make something out of them and we can buy them back, we seem to have an opportunity in the future of reindustrialising in this country that nobody's paying much attention to, because we can have an abundance of cheap, clean electricity. So rather than find ways to give that to somebody else, how about we find ways of employing ourselves and attracting industry here and building industry here? Why are we stuck with this? It all has to happen on another bit of land somewhere.
I think that when Australians think about this, in the pit of their stomach, they feel a bit, bloody hell, you know, we're a big old country, the rainfall's a bit marginal, we've got agriculture but not much. You know what, we dig stuff up and we sell it to people, and that's kind of how we pay off the bank card. That's how people kind of intuitively think. If they don't like it, they kind of kick the dirt and they're like, you know, this is kind of what we do. The narrative that you've just set out is the essential narrative that we must tell, that this is actually a pathway to greater prosperity, to actually, our competitive advantage is we've got so much land that's absolutely free in key places where the renewable resources are absolutely fantastic. So you put a solar panel there, you put a wind turbine there, you're going to get a disproportionately larger amount of energy than anybody else is going to get in most places of the world. And we can then harness that, and we can keep exporting ships filled with ammonia or with hydrogen, if the technology is developed for transportation, to power the Japanese economy, the South Korean economy, in the way we always have. And in fact, if we don't act, we're the ones that are going to be left behind. The pit in the stomach should come if we don't act on this stuff. That's the story we've got to tell. I think it's really powerful. Yep.
John, thanks very much. Sorry, I'm sneaking into a question now. I've had a comment, but hopefully you'll allow it. Let's assume worst case scenarios, regardless of politics. Let's assume worst case scenarios. We lose the large scale renewable energy targets. We lose subsidies on small scale rooftops, wind or whatever. Are we worrying unnecessarily? I'm just going to put forward that could the solar industry, could the wind industry and everybody else take that bullet? We know that whenever there's subsidies in the past, the industry attracts a whole bunch of cowboys and they gallop in with their hats on, and the market takes off, and then the subsidies go away and they all fall apart and we're left with crap systems. If we leave it to the power of the market, and we're there now, we've never been there before, so this is new territory for us all. If we leave it to the power of the market, wind, solar, we can keep building probably quite a considerable number of years into the future cost effectively. I'm encouraged by this by the chair of AGL, when pressure was put to bear, brought by a particular government onto the chair of AGL to say keep Liddell open, and he said, look, economically it's not going to work. We will shut that down, we will use the interconnects to build solar and wind, and off we go. So I'm wondering, unsurprisingly perhaps, industry, society, technology is at the front of this.
I get it, I understand.
And those politicians will eventually get the message.
I get it.
But I'm not sure they're going to get it this time.
And there is no doubt that in the long term, renewables are inevitable. It's economics, it's the market forward, you're right. But I think it's a dangerous narrative. And I think it's a dangerous narrative because the tools that a government has at their disposal to put sticks into the spokes of our industry go well beyond just not providing active support in support programs. Actually, it's about wiping out research funding. It's about wiping out, it's about changing rules. So let's say one of our association opponents is active right now to try and change the network connection rules to mean that as a blanket rule, you can't connect more than 5 kilowatts from a rooftop solar system to a network anywhere in Australia. That's their agenda, right? That'd be outrageous and devastating for our industry, right? There are lots of things they can do to stuff us up, and they will do all of those. They will prosecute them. They're smart, and they'll do whatever it takes. This is just a signal of intent. So I would caution against complacency. The other complacency that I'd caution against is this. Climate change is a problem for our grandchildren. No, it's not. It's a problem for their parents, but guess what? It's a problem for you and me today. And I don't care if you're 78 years of age. It's a problem for us today. It's our problem. It's not a future generation. We have to take action. And guess what? Here we are in a room today, right? Our job is to go and multiply this room from being 30 people, right, to being 30,000 people, right? That's the task ahead of us.
We've got two issues here. One of them's renewables, one of them's storage. At the moment, can renewables provide us with all the energy we need? Is it going to be equal what coal-fired power is doing? Can it be proven? Because that's what I think the country as a whole, some countries like Iceland can run totally on renewable energy because they've got the factors in place, geothermal. But we haven't got the storage capacity here. I've got a place in Hunter Valley that runs totally on solar and batteries, but I can do that because I tweak the system. But if I use power like I use in the city, my batteries will be flat in 10 minutes. So storage is the real issue.
So it's interesting, the Kidman solar farm up in, so they're doing solar, wind and pumped hydro storage as part of that, an old disused gold mine. The CWP project up in the Pilbara, northern Western Australia. The correlation in those places between the solar resource and the wind resource, a daytime resource and a nighttime resource, is actually pretty interesting, but it's nowhere near matched. There are lots of gaps there, right? You have to have storage. Storage is part of this. That's why we advocate smart power, because it actually is going to require smart storage. It's going to require the smart IT systems that optimise energy use and optimisation, right? All of that needs to be automated, because at the moment the energy sector is dumb. The networks don't even know what's happening on the network. They don't even know what's happening, right? So there's a massive transformation that needs to happen. So storage is definitely part of it, and that's why storing excess energy as solar fuels and gases is interesting. Storing excess energy in short-term lithium-ion batteries, which might be centralised or distributed, or other new technologies that you really smart people are about, well, probably in the process of inventing, right? And things like pumped hydro that gives you the large-scale, longer-term storage capabilities are all part of the mix. They're all going to be important in the thing. The other question is, if we're advocating 100% renewables, you might find that getting to 90% is possible. The last 10% is going to be wickedly expensive, right? And we need to confront those things as they come. They are genuine questions, though, but things we need to think about.
Thank you. If so many storage technologies still need to be invented, is like a 50% target for 2030 realistic?
Absolutely. I mean, there are experts in this room who I'm sure focus on this stuff.
I might make a comment. I think Australia is extremely well placed to go to 100% renewable. John mentioned a lot of good things in our. We're a small country. We're a small load in a very big country. So and we've got good, strong network connections all up and down the east coast. WA's on its own, but that's another story. So when there's solar and the wind, when there's wind in the southern part and sun in the north, that helps us. A very good study on this is Mark Diesendorf and his team, who've looked at modelling for Australia and what would it take to go 100% renewable. Now, there's lots of different technologies that can be used. John's mentioned the most of them. My own feeling is that wind, solar, pumped hydro, batteries may well have a role to play when that price comes down. Those technologies are here and now or very, very close. So we can scale to 50% renewables, and the shortfalls can be made up by gas generators. The most expensive part of that will be the gas generators, because the price of gas is so high, because Australia is busy selling domestic gas at the same price as we sell internationally. That's what opened the door for solar and wind to be the cheapest way of generating electricity in Australia. So the issue now, going to 100% not a problem if we really want to do it. In Australia we have the easiest job, a mild climate, small load, small population, big country, lots of renewable resources. Australia is in the position of being the potentially one of the easiest countries to make this transition, and we can be at the cutting edge, or we can bury our heads in the sand.
It reminds me of a really important story. When Julia Gillard did a deal with the Greens that ultimately saw a carbon price come in, one of the things the Greens insisted on is that AEMO, the operator of the network, model a 100% renewables system. They did. These are the pointy heads who actually run the network. And what they found was it's achievable, it's viable, and it would probably be cheaper in the long run than what we currently do. They were the findings, right? Now, of course, that's not in anyone's interest. They buried it somewhere, and that report, but there's lots of experts that have done the work, and it is basically is the answer.
Maybe let's have the last question. So maybe Alison.
So John, you mentioned in your talk the poor uptake of EVs in Australia. So how do you think Australian governments should incentivise EV uptake? I mean, what could they do?
So personally, I think that it's a bit like the early solar support, right? Provide some assistance that's regularly reviewed and phased out over time. So if the transition in price actually happens really quickly, then actually it reflects that and we're not paying unnecessarily. At the same time, if we don't put our shoulder to the wheel and get that economy of scale happening, then the price won't come down. You know, we see it with Teslas, for example. There's a huge market in North America, huge demand, so we don't see the cars here for years after they're actually released, like the Model 3, for example. And so we do need to do that, but in a sensible way, a staged way, and it's not going to be support needed forever. I drive an electric vehicle. I got a second-hand Volt about 18 months ago. So it's pure electric, but it's got a little generator if you run out of electricity. The fuel tank holds $40 worth of fuel. I last put fuel into my electric vehicle in July last year. I had to take my wife's car to the petrol station the other day. I was like, man, I hate this place. You know, I never want to come back here again. So.
Can I just make a quick comment on that? In California, they let electrical vehicles drive in the transit zone on the freeways to incentivise them, so that if you can let them drive with the buses and with the taxis, so that they don't get stuck in traffic.
Just another note. I mean, sure, fast charging is going to be more, but I charge my car by plugging it into a power point, which is in my shed. It's a 10 amp power point, right? And that's how I charge it.
Power?
Sorry?
Do you need three-phase power?
No, not at all.
No, banging that last night.
Oh, it's just a nonsense. It's a nonsense. Yeah.
Well, I've never heard of that.
No, it's a nonsense. Now, this is what I'm talking about, right? Discredit. Make it disreputable, spread misinformation. That's what's happening. Yeah. But of course, ladies and gentlemen, the electric vehicles will take your weekend, so be very careful.
Yeah. Okay, we have class after us.
Okay.
So let's take John again. It was great.
Thanks very much.